Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat, the #1 UK veterinary podcast. I'm so pleased to be meeting with Becky Maher this afternoon. We met previously at one of the conferences and got chatting about some of the fantastic work that Becky has been doing for her PGCert. Becky's going to introduce herself properly in a minute, but it was all around consumer psychology. And I must admit, I love a little bit of pop psychology. I'm not a psychologist myself, but I think we all are, to some degree, psychologists in that we read people every day, don't we? And I must admit, two of my favorite books I've read in the last couple of years, Becky, have been the Art of Persuasion or Influence by Cialdini, and also The Chimp Paradox. So thank you so much for coming on. Perhaps tell us a little bit about your journey that's brought you to this particular training, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how influence and psychology is really important when we're talking to our clients.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a veterinary surgeon by training. I started out in small animal practice. And after a few years in practice, the learning curve started to flatten a little bit. And at that point, I came to realise quite quickly that I wanted to do something different with my degree than stay in clinical practice. And that's when I started looking around for other opportunities. I was really lucky to get a great opportunity in industry in pharmaceuticals. And so I moved into the veterinary pharmaceutical sector, and I've been there for over 18 years, up until very recently, actually. So in my time there, I've worked in all sorts of different roles, from marketing roles, technical roles. I've led teams and built teams. But one of the things that really fascinated me through my time in industry is that I've been really lucky to work on some really groundbreaking clinical studies in my time in industry. And, I'm talking the kind of studies that really changed the face of medical recommendations. We'd be sitting in a room with the most eminent specialists in that therapy area saying to us, this is groundbreaking, this is a no-brainer, this is going to change everything. And we'd be so excited, and we'd take it out to the profession. And again, the profession would be so excited, and they would tell us that this is going to change everything that we do. But what we didn't always see was a change in behavior off the back of that. And I found that really fascinating, that, you can have all the evidence, all the science behind you to say that you should do something, and yet we don't always do it. And, when you look around in the rest of our lives, you see that all the time, right? You see January, we make lots of promises to ourselves that we probably ditch by February or March, not through a lack of intention to carry them through, but just through human nature. You see people wanting to save money for their long-term future, and giving that up instead, so that they can have a bit of gratitude now in the short term. And I found that really, really fascinating, that gap between intention and behavior. And that's what really led me to the door of consumer psychology.
What's really interesting, we as scientists, you would think that we would really place science and the logic absolutely first. And yet, as individuals, we're all emotional individuals, aren't we? And actually, emotion tends to trump logic, doesn't it?
100%. Yeah. I mean, even the big decisions in life that we would think, must be driven by rationality. Surely they're such big decisions, whether it's buying a house, buying a car, investing in your pension, deciding who you're going to marry. These are all decisions which you would think they're so gargantuan that they would be driven largely by rational thought. But all the evidence is that actually, the vast majority of the time, whether the decision is something small like what to have for breakfast this morning, or whether it's something massive like which house to buy, it's driven really by a primitive mind. We talk about system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. System 1 being the kind of evolutionary old gut instinct, that kind of snap decision that we make when we're before we even really think consciously. And that's what takes control the vast majority of the time, over and above system 2 thinking, which is the slower, rational, more effortful thinking where we're weighing up evidence. We actually put that into play relatively rarely because it's tough for us. It's not easy for our brains to do that. And very often it's coming into play after our system 1 has already made a decision and we're post hoc rationalizing what we've already decided we're going to do.
And I think this is really interesting because I know you've just recently done a PGCert, and that was very much part of your research, but bringing it very much into the veterinary field, which is fascinating. And I'm really interested in how, particularly from all the work that Cialdini did, how important the way we present ourselves is so important to whether a client takes a blood test or has a dental procedure done. Nobody likes to say that word dental, has a dental procedure done on their cat or their dog. You know, that whole process is really important, isn't it? So perhaps tell us a little bit about the PGCert that you did and the some of the thesis work that you did and the surveys and experiments.
Yeah, sure. So I set out in my sort of final thesis to answer the question around whether how we present ourselves as clinicians affects how credible we're seen to be, how likable we're seen to be, and whether or not it affects people's intention to engage with us and to listen to us. And so I did, there were 2 arms to the study that I ran. One was looking at the impact of those things on the veterinary surgeon audience, and one on pet owners as well. And what I did was I set up for vets, I set up some mock CPD events. And there was a mixture of vets wearing clinical dress, specialists wearing clinical dress with stethoscopes around their neck, and letters after their name to show all of their credentials, versus more casual dress and just a description of their job title and hospital title. And those were all mixed up so that you could establish which of those were the important factors. And similarly for pet owners, I did the same thing, but using social media posts instead of CPD events. And really interestingly, what we saw was that for both the way that we present ourselves in terms of how we dress, so whether you're wearing clinical dress versus casual or smart casual, and how we present our credentials, so whether or not you put your letters after your name or you just use hospital name and job title, had a massive impact on how credible we're seen to be, how likable we're seen to be, how attractive we are as well, which is quite interesting, but most importantly, how likely the audience is to engage with anything that we've got to say and believe us. So, from a vet practice perspective, a really simple, easy way to dial up the credibility, to dial up how much your practice is liked by the clients that are walking in through the door and how likely they are to listen to you. Dressing vets in clinical dress, putting scrubs or lab coats, stethoscope around the neck is a really easy, quick win. And similarly, if you're presenting your team, whether it be on your website or in any of your written communications or even on your door, the nameplate on your door, putting all of those qualifications after their names, again, dials up the credibility and likability by a really, really significant amount.
Do you want to become a part of the largest online veterinary community in the world? The Webinar Vets membership is the perfect tool to easily complete your veterinary CPD or CE. Watch webinars anytime, any place, on any connected device. Become a member today and explore our library of over 2,000 premium quality webinars. We also care about the environment as well as your CPD or CE. That's why we plant trees for every one of our members. To find out more, visit thewebinarvet.com/memberships or click on the membership tab on our website.
I always ask on the podcast to come up with some top tips. I think that's definitely a tip 1. Have you got any other tips that you'd like to give us as how we can use some of the consumer psychology to help clients make better choices? Because I always felt when I was in the room with the client and with the pet, I always said, that there are three of us in this relationship, three people. I personalize the dog or the cat. I'm very much, it was a partnership, but I was obviously more an advocate for the pet. So I wanted to do the absolute best for the pet. And I think this was where people would appreciate that and understand that, as that you were there to give them that advice. And then they were more likely to take the advice than if you hadn't positioned that at the beginning of the, serious talk that you had about a pet that maybe needed to be put to sleep or would need quite a lot of work done, which obviously would incur quite a bit of cost.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's one of the principles that, you mentioned Cialdini's book. That's one of the principles he talks about, that sense of belonging and community. By building that, that team, as it were, then that's very persuasive. It's one of his key principles. But yeah, I mean, in terms of top tips, I would say that one really important thing is to make sure that you tap into emotions. Think about, we're very good as vets at delivering the science and delivering the evidence, and as a wider clinic team, explaining to clients why they need to do something, and that's brilliant. We need to do that. But what we also need to understand is that the thing that will tip somebody into changing their behavior is much more likely to be their emotions. And so by finding an emotional appeal, rather than just a rational appeal, we can be so much more persuasive and help lead the pet owner into a decision which is going to be in the interests of the pet.
I think, Becky, you said before, and it was really key, that people, buy from those and work with those that they like. So it's the likable personality, isn't it? It's being able to introduce yourself so they know who you are, make sure that you mention the pet, smile. And sometimes that can be difficult if we're really busy, but actually that the client goes away and says, Becky, Anthony, gosh, they're a really nice person. They're much more likely to actually follow up and do what you've asked, rather than, gosh, look at all the initials he's got after his name, but he seemed to be really dour and a bit miserable. They're less likely to follow up on the veterinary recommendations then, aren't they?
That's it. I think being likable is actually way more important than we tend to realize, because as humans, we're not very good at understanding what it is that we're feeling. So if we like somebody or we like something, our brains will often confuse that slightly and think they're really credible, they're super believable, they know a lot about this, all these different things that your system one will offer up, instead of telling you, oh, you like them. And so being likable is really, really key. And also thinking about, if you're describing the benefit of doing something, so I don't know, it could be a treatment that's going to extend a dog's life, rather than just explaining that this treatment may provide them with however many months of extra life, thinking about the emotional appeal that might sit with that. So which means that you will get to spend, however many months of extra time enjoying life together, building it up into an emotional appeal, not just the rational.
I think you had a third tip for us that I cut you off on.
No, you're quite all right. I think the third tip from me would be to make everything really super easy to consume. So this speaks to the consumer psychology principle of perceptual fluency, which basically is that perceptual fluency is how easy we find it to decode a message and for our brains to sort of unravel it and work out what it means. And there are some really simple things that we can do to make things easier for people to understand. So, for example, using language which is really easy to understand, using everyday language, everyday words that people will understand, rather than any other kind of, abbreviations or words that are going to be tricky for people to get under the skin of. In written communications, thinking about the fonts that you use, the layout that you've got, all these different things that you can do to make sure that it's very easy for our brains to take the message on board. And perceptual fluency also links to liking. If it's easy for us to understand something, we're more likely to like it. And as we've already spoken about, If we like something, then we're going to associate all sorts of other positive things with it as well. So making things simple, making things easy to understand, and using language that is really accessible regardless of who's sat in front of you are really, really key.
I think it's really interesting and paradoxical that we have some really divisive figures recently in politics, and I'm thinking about a previous politician. I won't mention his name, but he obviously used very complicated words because he wanted to show everybody how clever he was.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, and was a popular figure and obviously was elected as prime minister. But there's obviously a twist there that some people must kind of like that, but at the same time, trust probably goes down because you're not trusting them as much, because there's a risk with all of this stuff that you're talking about, consumer psychology. It can very much be used as a force for good or a force for evil, can't it? And it's making sure that we use it in a way that isn't manipulative, but is helping people to make the right decision for the pet,
100%.
etc.
Yeah, 100%. And one really important principle of consumer psychology is retaining that element of choice, so that you're never strong arming somebody into a decision. You're never manipulating, as you say. It's very much just understanding what's likely to be going on in somebody's subconscious that might mean that if you present something in a certain way, you're going to push them away from it unknowingly. And so it's with that understanding, you can then present things in such a way that if they want to go in that direction, you're stepping out of their way to allow them to do that. If you see what I mean. So it's more about working with the subconscious and just not getting in the way of it.
And I think if we're open to this and we want to learn, as we get older, we get better at it if we've got a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset of this is the way I always do things and it's worked really well for me. Whereas going into a bit more depth in this area, I think can be really pay dividends for people, can't it?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think, in terms of being able to improve client satisfaction, people will feel better about coming into the clinic. They will like the clinic more and the people in it more. So, from a client's perspective, that's a win. They can be encouraged to make decisions that are in the right interest for the pet. So again, healthier pet, happier owner. There's so much to gain from all of this, from looking under the bonnet and really understanding what it is that drives behaviour.
I'd perhaps like to finish, Becky, by welcoming you to the club. That's the entrepreneurial club, because as you mentioned earlier on, you've just left. I think I can say Boehringer Ingelheim, not for any particular negative reason, but that you've been so fascinated by this consumer psychology that you've actually started a new company, InsideMinds Consulting. Perhaps tell us a little bit at the end as to how you see that working and who are the people that you're looking to help with the new business.
Sure. So I see InsideMinds Consulting as being for vet practices and for the companies that serve them. And really what I want to do is to bring consumer psychology into the consciousness of vets and the companies that serve them, so that we can work together to help encourage clients to make decisions that are in the right interest of the pet. And as I said earlier, stepping out of the way of their subconscious, making sure that we don't prevent them from making the right decision for their pets. So I'm in the fledgling stages really of setting up the business. I'm in week 2, so it's very early days. But I will be offering educational services and auditing services where I can go into the clinics and look at things, and if any point of contact that the client has with the practice where there's an opportunity to encourage a good decision in terms of pet healthcare. So looking at things like, for example, health plans, whether or not the choices that are being presented in such a way to encourage a pet owner to take action, encouraging persuasive communication, things like that. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's a great opportunity to take what I've learned through my studies of consumer psychology and apply it to the veterinary world. And I think there's a whole myriad of ways in which it can be applied.
And of course, a world that you're very familiar with, because I do think that's so important. Sometimes we as vets, we can say, oh, we don't like being a vet anymore, and we leave. And I always feel that's a shame if we're losing skills and they're going into another area where perhaps after 5-10 years, they don't have any experience. People are very versatile. I'm sure they can pick that up. But actually, you've been an example of somebody who was in a clinic, who then went into corporate pharmaceutical life, and now using all those skills that you've learned to continue to work within the veterinary profession and to enrich and to help the profession. And it's really important to think that we have people of all different types within the profession, because if we end up just with one type, it's a dangerous place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see the veterinary degree really as a passport into all sorts of different types of work in the veterinary sector. And I've been really lucky to get the opportunities that I've had in the pharmaceutical industry, and through that, I've learned a ton, and it's created, it's lit this flame inside me in terms of consumer psychology as well. So it's led me to where I am today. But yeah, I very much believe that when you graduate as a vet, clinical work is just one path that you can take. There are so many others as well.
Becky, it's been lovely speaking to you. I think we've come up with some really lovely tips there that are really worth considering. I always say with a webinar, with a podcast, whatever we do at Webinar Vet, I want the listener, the watcher, to go away with perhaps one thing that they can take into their clinical practice that will make them a better vet. And often that's clearly a clinical skill or a clinical tip. But when you think, a lot of the complaints that come through the Royal College aren't about he didn't know how to spay a cat. It's very much a communication problem. And the psychology and the likability, this all comes into that. So I do hope those people who are listening enjoy it. We're going to put underneath the podcast ways that you can get hold of Becky for a chat or an email discussion. But I do wish you all the best with the new business. I think it's a great idea. It's one of those areas that I must admit, I am a pop psychologist. I do love reading these books. I'm not nearly as academic as obviously you are, but it's so important because people buy from people. And if we can be more likable, and that's a genuine thing, I think the world goes around a bit easier, doesn't it? If you're working with people and you're interacting with people and you're not in conflict. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. And as I say, good luck for the fledgling business.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. This is Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet. This was another episode of VETchat. Bye-bye.